Hey, folks, welcome to another episode of Cutter One. I am your host, Jay, just Jay. Anyway, I wanted to. Yesterday, we got some information out of Nielsen, um, and it's kind of interesting in regards to Rings of Power. And it's in regards to they highlight an interesting little bit of information. So let's get right to it. I really want to. I think it illustrates something. So it says Rings of Power appears to be struggling to connect with younger viewers. And then you see some of the bullet points are Amazon's Lord of the Rings of Power, may have struggled to attract younger viewers. 71% of its audience was 35 years or older at the season one midway point, according to Nielsen. Other data suggests the show had limited reach when it came to online engagement. Um, and then they go into start explaining everything. Amazon's Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power might have a problem with younger audiences. Expectations were high for the series, which concluded its first season on Friday, given its hefty reported price tag of $465 million to make season one. It's $465 million to make season one. Just to give you a point of comparison, the Peter Jackson trilogy, all three movies of the original Lord of the Rings trilogy by Peter Jackson, cost 281 million. So these guys had 465 million. Peter Jackson had 281 million. I don't know. You tell me who got the most bang for their buck. Anyway, and while the limited viewership numbers we've seen have been decent, the series could have still struggled to connect with an important demographic. 71% of the show's audience is 35 years or older in the US, according to Nielsen's latest streaming data from Thursday, which measured through the show's fourth episode. By comparison, 68% of the audience for HBO's own fantasy series House of the Dragon is in the 18 to 49 age range. Now, why is this significant? Well, again, coming from an indie filmmaker background, I tend to look at information like this in terms of it, it's reflective of not only your audience and what demographic they're fitting, but what you're really it'll set your expectations. Okay, 71% of a show's of Rings of Power's audience being 35 years or older means 71% or 7 out of 10 viewers, um, Rings of Power was not their first exposure to Tolkien, his work, or The Lord of the Rings. Being 35 years or of age or older, these are people who would have memories of seeing the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings trilogy if that was their first exposure to Tolkien. If they're older than significantly older than that, say once you get up into people who are in their you know 40s and so on and so forth, that experience with Tolkien gets even deeper because these are people that may have been exposed to his work through the novels, through his books, Legendarium, um, at a younger age. Like in my case, I was exposed to Tolkien in the 1980s. Okay, so by the time Peter Jackson's movies came around, I was very familiar with Tolkien, and so Rings of Power showing up 20 years later, um, I have a familiarity with it, as would an audience that is 35 years and older, which turns out, according to Nielsen, to be 7 out of 10 viewers. The reason why this is significant is because these are people that are already attached to the lore. You see, this is an aspect that, as an indie filmmaker, it would catch my attention. These are people that would already have an attachment and affinity for this world, this work, this lore. And so when you come out with your new product, you're not introducing them to any they that audience wants to see what it knows, what it's familiar with. They don't want some new fan fiction version of what they're used to. They want to see what they know, be it either through something similar in style and scope of Peter Jackson's work or just what they had always envisioned in the original author's work in Tolkien's novels. So it's interesting that that was the majority of people watching The Rings of Power. And I see that as translating. See, the article then goes on to say that um, Insider reached out to Amazon representatives for comment on Nielsen's demographic data, whether it is reflective of global trend or whether they could offer any audience data of their own, but they did not receive a response ahead of the publication. Rings of Power audience leaning older could have contributed to its seemingly muted online conversation, at least compared to the House of the Dragon. Now, my take on this part is obviously they're trying to say, well, because it's older people, it's older demographic, they're not as social media savvy, that they're not out there talking with their friends on social media, which there may be some validity to that aspect of it. But I also think because I saw a lot of people talking about Rings of Power, a lot of people. Now I tend to follow um more sort of specialized, content creators here on YouTube. Some of you may know them, guys like Nerdrotic, Gary from Nerdrotic, you know, Disparu, Ryan Cannell from RK Outpost. These guys were talking about it all the time. So, when they say it had a muted online conversations regarding Rings of Power, I think that really depends on where you were looking. Maybe on Twitter, things were somewhat muted. Um, but I know in the content creator space here on YouTube, a lot of people were talking about it, not in a positive way. A lot of people didn't like it. And I think that's really what these numbers reflect. These numbers of 71% of their audience being 35 and older, as well as a seemingly muted response in the social media spheres, I think all comes back to Rings of Powers made the majority of its audience was people who were familiar with Tolkien, who know Tolkien, who know how it's supposed to be. They know the lore, they love the lore, they like the lore. They don't want to see you come in and start beating them over the head with agenda driven messages and changing the lore, destroying the lore, ignoring the lore. And so I think that number, that 71% being 35 and older, I think that has a lot to do with why, at least in some regards, Rings of Power has been somewhat of a failure. It didn't grab the audience that in the way that HBO was hoping that it would. And again, I think that's because the core of your audience was always going to be an older demographic that was familiar with this work. It's not going to be a 15-year-old kid who's never seen a Tolkien movie, or who's only ever heard about Tolkien in some sort of secondhand fashion. It was going to be people who are familiar with the books, familiar with the previous iteration with Peter Jackson's films, and that's what you were up against. You were up against the source material and what is arguably one of the best trilogies ever created, and film adaptations of a book ever created. And I think that's why they came up short. I think they assessed who their primary audience. It wasn't going to be the 18 to 49 crowd. It was never going to be that. It was always going to be the 35 plus crowd. And that's where they screwed up. People who are 35 plus, they don't want to be lectured to. They don't want to hear modern politics and modern messaging. They want to see faithful, lore correct adaptations of what they know. Anyway, that's coming from Business Insider. That information was released yesterday on the 17th, and I just thought I'd go over it with you. I thought it was interesting. I think there's a lot of ways that you can look at those numbers, and sort of get a feel for why the show didn't perform the way HBO was hoping it would have performed. I mean, HBO, Amazon was hoping that it was going to perform. So anyway, let me know what you guys think. Did you like Rings of Power? Do you think my assessment of what those Nielsen numbers mean is correct, or do you think I'm completely off the mark on that one? So yeah, we'll go ahead, and that will be that. If you like what I'm doing here and you want to support the channel, remember to hit the subscribe button, give it a like, a thumbs up, leave a comment. I'd love to hear back from you guys. Audience engagement is like a big thing. I really like it. So yeah, so let me know what you think and if you agree with what I'm saying. And until then, I will see you on the next episode. Peace.